So you're gonna have to let me know when it comes up. Whoops, gotta go back one. All right, everybody see that okay? Juno, you got that? Juno, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you, great. All right, so New Hampshire has a lot of wildlife. There's a good diversity of different wildlife species. Some are more familiar than others to us. All sorts of birds and mammals, reptiles, amphibians, a plethora of insects and other invertebrates that share the environment with us. And part of that diversity comes from the diversity of habitats that are also found in the state. Everything from the coastal areas to the highest mountains and alpine zones. We have a good number of acres of unbroken forest, especially in the White Mountain National Forest, talus slopes, rocky ridges, lakes, ponds, streams, wetlands. So a variety of different habitats that wildlife can take advantage of. So if we have this diversity of wildlife and diversity of habitats, why should we bother with what's in our own backyards? Well, in my opinion, and scientists agree that the majority of wildlife species, not only in New Hampshire, but around the world, are at risk because of habitat loss. That's the leading cause of some of the loss that we have in our wildlife populations. So whatever we can do or what role we can play in our own neighborhoods or yards or communities in small ways contributes to creating or maintaining habitat that wildlife can use. So if you're planning backyard wildlife projects, think about diversity. You have a diversity of vegetation types around your yard, and in your yard, or your neighbors have diversity as well, there'll likely be a diversity of wildlife species. When you're thinking about creating wildlife habitat, there's essentially 4 components of habitat. Habitat is essentially the animal's place that they live, and they need to find all the resources necessary to survive and reproduce. So obviously food is a main component, since all organisms have to have energy to survive. Water, cover or shelter is the third, and then space. And space is essentially a large enough place where that animal can get all the resources it needs to survive. Habitat needs vary, obviously by species, but also by the season and often by life stages. And the woodcock, American woodcock, is one really good example of an animal that uses a variety of different habitats. In this early spring, when the males return, they come to open display grounds or singing grounds, some people call them, where they do their aerial display. They sit on the ground, they do their little peent sound that they make, and then the male takes off into the air. Its wings make a kind of a twittering sound as they fly. The air flows through the feathers, and then they go way up in the sky where you can hardly see them. And then they return to the ground, giving some little chirps as they come down. In some ways, they look a little bit like a leaf that's falling to the ground. They sort of rock back and forth and end up back on the ground where they started. When they've finished breeding, then the female finds a place in mostly young, early successional deciduous forests, like down in the lower left-hand corner there, where there's some aspen and birch. Lots of good cover for the nests and the precocial young that leave the nest within 24 or 48 hours after they hatch. And then as they mature, they start visiting more wetland areas where there's alder swamps, places where the ground is soft and moist. They can get that long probing beak into the ground to catch earthworms and other invertebrates. So a lot of variation, even within that one species. So let's start with food as one of the components of habitat. Most of us Most of us think about food and we think about feeding birds, but that's just one source of food for birds that visit our yards. Most of us are trying to keep that away from the bears by removing feeders at night or taking them out for the season or chasing away the turkeys that have learned to knock on the feeder and knock the seeds to the ground. But there are other ways to contribute food to wildlife habitat. The first one is a lot of fruiting trees and shrubs that provide food for lots of birds, lots of mammals, and insects as well. Scientists refer to that kind of crop of food sources, the fruits, as soft mast. And it can be blueberries and huckleberries and highbush cranberry, apples, various species of roses. Shrubs can fruit all the way from the late spring through parts of the summer, all the way into the fall. And some shrubs hold their fruits all the way through the winter and even on into the spring. They're a little rotten by then, but they still supply food for a variety of birds and other animals. And insects too. Insects will burrow into that rotting fruit, and then the next bird that comes along and eats that fruit gets a little protein snack along the way. The other group of food sources that are really important are the nuts. So hard mast includes the acorns and the beech nuts, which are important food sources for deer and turkey. Bears especially fatten up on the acorns and the beech nuts in the fall. The beaked hazelnut down in the right-hand corner there is another good nut source. And then a variety of trees that produce seeds like the birches and the aspen that birds will eat, and other small mammals will also feed on. So hard mast is another important food source that you can contribute in your backyard. The hard and soft mast, we kind of associate them with mostly birds, but there are a lot of mammals that depend on those food sources as well. The bear and the coyote and the fox are all classified as carnivores, but they eat a lot of fruits and nuts and things like that during the rest of the year, even when they're not catching the small mammals that are so abundant. And porcupines this time of year, they'll be out in your yard picking up the fresh sprouts in your garden, or more likely the fresh sprouts coming up in fields in the edges of the woods, the tender greens that are coming up. And then in the fall, they'll feed on the apples and the acorns and things that are left behind to fatten up for the winter. So other than the soft and hard mast species, there are flowers. Not only flowers to eat, but flowers to produce nectar for those pollinating insects that are looking for a sweet meal. They come in all different shapes and colors, and most of us take advantage of those to beautify our yards if we're so inclined. But they're also an important food source for a lot of insects. And of course, the insects and the other invertebrates that don't go for the nectar, but go for the insects that are attracted to those flowers. A diversity of flowers means a diversity of all kinds of different insects. Some are pests in your garden, some are not, and just passing through the garden as well. I kind of think of the garden as sort of an insect factory in many ways, producing food for lots of other animals, especially birds. So a lot of our migratory birds that come back from Central and South America or point south in the US depend heavily on the insects that are produced in New Hampshire to raise their young. They go for those insects, those nice fat, juicy insects, for extra protein for their young. There are a whole bunch of other animals too that are going to feed on those insects that are visiting that pollinator garden. Toads you probably have in your garden eating slugs and other insects and other invertebrates, chipmunks, the various snakes. Even owls can benefit from a flower garden. If you think about it, those flower gardens with all those insects are going to attract small mammals, and then the owls and hawks can go after the small mammals. So it's like a big food factory in your backyard. Water, of course, is another important component for wildlife habitat. Most animals get the majority of their water from the food that they metabolize, but there are certainly some animals that are drawn more to water for baths and for drinking. Some, like amphibians, depend on water, of course, for breeding. And many of those wetlands provide, with a thick vegetation around their borders, provide good corridors for animals to move from one place to another. And if you don't have the space for a pond or a pool, and are inclined to build a bird bath, just having a section of your property with longer, taller vegetation that collects the morning dew and stays moist is a good water source, not only for birds drinking the water off the tips of the plants on a good dewy morning, but extra moisture for those amphibians that may pass through the yard or through your property. They need to stay moist as they go. Then there's cover or shelter. That's the third component of habitat that's very important. Cover or shelter provides shelter from the elements, from weather, and also from predators or from each other. One of the probably most important plant that you could plant in your yard, whether it's just a small plot in town or a bigger property, is conifers. Conifers are sort of like a bonus prime real estate type of vegetation that you can plant or support on your property. They provide good cover both winter and summer. So in the winter, they protect from snow and ice and wind. There's a little microclimate in there where it's a little bit warmer in that dense vegetation. In the summer, it's a little bit cooler for animals to be able to get in where it's cool and provide good roosting cover during the day, especially for things like owls. Conifers are great because they grow really quickly, so you can fill in spaces with conifers. And there are low-growing conifers like junipers and taller conifers like balsam fir and spruce that provide good cover as well. And as they grow, you can cut them back and they'll sprout readily from seeds in the ground to provide cover again. So it's a nice way to rotate sort of the structure and composition of the vegetation on your land. When I was growing up, we had an American yew right outside our house, this huge yew. And every single summer there would be chipping sparrows nesting in that, often with robins and sometimes with a catbird that would find its way in there too. Sometimes at different times of the summer and sometimes at the same time, which was kind of nice. Really dense, thick cover, and it was cooler in there as well. And if you've ever seen a mourning dove nest, you know they're pretty flimsy. So conifers are a great platform for mourning doves to build their nest on. Gives them a little extra support and cover from predators at the same time. So when you're thinking about providing cover on your property, there are two things to think about. One is the composition. What kind of species are there? What kind do you want to see there? Are they conifers? Are they deciduous trees that are going to lose their leaves? Are they low-growing shrubs that sprout from underground roots and therefore form a tight cluster? Are they species that provide not only cover, but will fruit or seed and be a benefit to wildlife later? So composition is one piece, and then the other is the structure. The sizes, the shapes, the ages. So this is a forest off Route 16 in Ossipee, owned by the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests. There's pitch pine in the overstory. Those are the taller pines. And then underneath is a lot of scrub oak and sweet fern and birches that are coming up. Great habitat to go birding in. Lots of birds take advantage of that lower to mid-story vegetation. So different sizes that occur in there. And then the Forest Society will go in there periodically and do a controlled burn, which takes out the larger trees that are taking over, the large deciduous trees, and stimulates the blueberries and some of the other shrubs that are in the understory, and also stimulates the pitch pine cones to open and regenerate. So just to give you an example of how structure and composition work together, this is my lovely compost bin. And if I can get my arrow to work here, this is this area right in here is wild raspberries that came up naturally. My husband got a little crazy because they were getting in the way when he was mowing along the edge. So we cut those down and planted some sunflowers. We've got a little apple tree over here. This was a service berry here, or is a service berry. We planted some time ago that's really branched out because it's in the full sun. And some more raspberries next to it. And then I lost my arrow. There's some cedar here that is great cover, especially in the winter, for our bird feeder that's right in here. In a windy, snowy day, we'll plant seeds on the ground, put seeds on the ground there so that birds can feed without getting blown away and too cold. And then there's this little island over here of a mix of shrubs, fruiting shrubs. There's a bunch of viburnum in there, some winterberry, and then there's a black cherry up above. This is where all the songbirds go when the Cooper's hawk or the sharp-shinned hawk comes zipping through looking for a meal. There's great cover in there, even when the leaves are gone, because it's so thick. And the hawks have a hard time getting in there to get the birds. There's another example of kind of putting structure and composition together. This is mostly open field. When we bought the property, there is a black cherry that's right here. There were a few viburnums and a few staghorn sumac there. And it was a little island, which was great, except we decided that maybe it would be better to turn that island into a peninsula. So now it's a peninsula, or a little finger of different vegetation that sticks out into the field. And since we did that, we had a woodchuck come through and den underneath that cherry tree. And then this year there was a fox den. Started out using that den early and then moved their pups down the hill into the woods a little bit further. So a good example of putting all those kind of pieces together to increase diversity in that area. Fields with grasses and wildflowers are another important habitat kind of structure that you can maintain if you've got the space. It's always a kind of struggle to figure out when to mow and how to maintain it, but it depends a little bit on what you have growing there. So something like a bobolink really needs kind of grassy hay fields for nesting. They don't really use the meadows or the fields that have lots of shrubs and ferns and things like that growing up. It's mostly hay fields. Flickers, like the bird down in the lower right-hand corner, uses shorter grass, especially in the spring when they're migrating in their search for ants. Both mowed fields and long grasses in fields are used by coyotes and fox for hunting for small mammals. In my household, we annually argue over, argue might be a strong word, but argue over when to mow our field. And my husband likes to do it towards the end of August into September after the nesting birds. I like to do it in October after the snakes have been chilled and have gone underground, and I know they'll be safe from the mower. So we actually compromise and do it somewhere in between. But late summer flowers are wonderful sources for pollinators, and also seeds are produced later in the summer that birds will use on their migratory routes. Some structure in the woods that are really important are what's often called kind of down woody debris. Debris or slash makes it sound like it's not a good thing, but it's actually a very good thing in the forest. Humans, I think, tend to want to clean up the woods and make everything look neat and pretty and park-like, but really the best thing for wildlife is to live as much as we can on the forest floor. So logs, if they're on the ground, they don't take too long to rot if they're not too big. Old rotten stumps are great habitat for all kinds of vertebrates and invertebrates. So spotted salamanders, redback salamanders use those kinds of habitats. And then having that kind of debris or litter or stuff on the ground is great for a whole bunch of birds too when they're nesting in the summertime. So here's a spot on our land that you know, there was a timber harvest a number of years ago, and we just left things on the ground to rot and create habitat. So if you look carefully there, I'll give you a minute to take a peek. you'll see in there somewhere a grouse nest. Rough grouse will nest oftentimes at the base of a pine in dense vegetation, or the edges of brush piles, or in this kind of down woody stuff on the forest floor. So if you do a little search, right in here is where the nest is. You can see my arrow. This was all naturally, nice little roof that was natural there. The female pulled together some pine needles and twigs and made a little cup there, and there's about eight or nine eggs in there. I think it was 8 eggs. And I really didn't see it until I was almost stepped on it, and she flushed out. So that's great kind of structure in the forest floor that helps provide habitat for a variety of birds. If you just can't stand leaving all that kind of stuff on the forest floor after you've done a cut, or there's a lot of stuff that's blown down in the last storm, creating a brush pile is a good alternative. So you kind of clean up part of the forest floor and create brush piles that then provide that cover for species. Believe it or not, there are good ways to build brush piles. There aren't no such thing as a bad brush pile, but if you want them to last a little bit longer and have more space for more diversity of animals, taking the larger logs and crisscrossing them and then putting larger stuff and then smaller stuff on top, putting things in vertically, creates more space for snowshoe hares and rabbits and squirrels, mice and voles, sometimes bobcats. There's enough space at the base there. We'll use those as places to rest and hide, and also to hunt. There are a few non-living components of habitat that are useful. If you have some dead trees or snags on your property, leaving them there as long as you're safe and your house is safe is great for a variety of wildlife. Most owls don't build their own nests. They either use the nests of other birds, or they use places in trees where the top is broken off, or there's a cavity of where a branch is rotted out. Wood ducks depend on those natural cavities for nesting. They don't build a nest on the side of the lake or in the long grasses the way a Canada goose does. So they need those cavities in trees as well. And if you're looking for a chuckle, just do a little Google search on young wood ducklings or ducklings leaving the nest, and you'll see great videos of wood ducks jumping out of their cavities and kind of bouncing off the forest floor when they hit the ground. They're ready to go within 24 or 48 hours after they hatch, but they have no wings. I mean, they have wings, but they don't have any feathers, so they can't fly. They just have little stubby wings, and they just go for it, jumping out the cavity and bouncing off the ground to follow their mom. So leaving dead trees like that is really important, not only for the cavities that are created, but for woodpeckers to search for food in and create their own cavities for nesting. So the woodpeckers are the primary cavity nesters. They're the ones that create the cavities. And then there are a whole bunch of birds and other animals that use those cavities. They're referred to as secondary cavity nesters. So a bird like this great-crested flycatcher, chickadees, nuthatches, bluebirds, all of those types of birds are going to take advantage of those cavities when the woodpeckers are done, along with flying squirrels, gray squirrels, red squirrels, and mice as well, and bats too. Can't leave out bats. Bats will use cavities like this, or they'll use places in dead trees where bark is starting to peel up, especially northern long-eared bats, which are an endangered species. All those dead trees are great standing habitat. If you don't have any dead trees on your property, creating nest cavities is a great way to draw wildlife to your property. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I have a link to that at the end of the program, has great resources for building all kinds of different nest boxes for a whole variety of bird species, from bluebirds to owls to wood ducks, all of those boxes. The plans can be found. They'll tell you where to put them, how high up, what direction they should face, and you're good to go with that. So Stone walls and rock piles are another kind of, they're human caused, obviously, but they're another kind of natural cover component for wildlife in a habitat. The weasels will use them as travel lanes and search for mice at the same time. A lot of owls will hunt along stone walls because the mice and squirrels are using those crevices in the stone walls for living and hiding and feeding as they go. So those are sort of the main pieces of habitat for planning purposes, whether it's your kind of in town small yard that you might own or a larger property out of town, getting together with your neighbors, figuring out who has what on their property. So food, water, shelter, cover, and then the space that they need to raise their young. And space comes in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's, not going out and deciding to mow your field until later in the year when most of the young animals are safely out of their nest or out of their den. It might be giving them the space to den underneath your barn if they're not too much of a problem. So we can give them space just by sharing our habitat with animal habitat. I'm going to suggest a few things now that I've already talked about things you can do in your yard, suggest a few things that might be better not to do in your yard. Probably the best thing is not to use chemicals. They have an impact that we often don't see, especially on amphibians who have, amphibians have permeable skin. So they absorb a lot of those chemicals that, even if they're intended for weeds, have an effect on them. I know every fall when there's a good nut crop, we see a rise in mice and squirrels and chipmunks, and sometimes they're a bit pesky and get in the way. And I'm not going to tell you you shouldn't kill the mice that are in your house, but if you can find other ways to do that, then poison. The poison in the mice is an anticoagulant, so essentially they bleed internally, and if a hawk or an owl eats that, they have the same issue, or it reduces their ability to fight diseases and illness. So it's really not just bad for the mice, but bad for the other animals that use them for food. I'm also, I'm not going to tell you not to mow your lawn, but one of the beauties of having a lawn that you let go is that you'll get more diversity in pollinators, other types of insects, and all sorts of other animals that use the space for food, for nesting, or for travel lanes or corridors to get from one place to another. And the nice thing about it is if you decide to let a corner of your yard grow up into field and maybe some shrubs, and then you decide you don't like it, you can cut it down later. So it's a fun thing to try to experiment with and see what you get. There are certainly birds like flickers and robins that will use a lawn for gathering worms or ants, but you'll get a lot more diversity if you let part of your lawn go, and maybe part of your lawn go in the front one year and back in another year and front again in the next year. So there's all sorts of experimentation that you can do with that. I'd also encourage you, if you have a cat, to keep them indoors. Cats kill millions of songbirds every year, as well as rabbits, young rabbits and hares, and bats, squirrels, all sorts of other animals that we don't often see. We kind of think of them as our friendly little neighbor cats, but they have the instinct to catch and kill, and that's what they do, although they're well fed, so they don't usually eat what they catch. You can be a little creative with your indoor cat if you feel like it's too much to keep them in all the time. I know a lot of people who build little outdoor pens where they can explore, people who take their cats on walks. I had a cat that was clicker trained, so when I went out to work in the garden, I would let her out and keep an eye on her. And when she started to head to the stone wall where the chipmunks were hanging out, I would do my little clicker and give her a treat and have her come back and and either put her back inside or keep an eye on her again while she hung out with me around the garden. So be a little creative and think about ways you can let your cat enjoy the outdoors, but keep the other wildlife safe. And then, of course, I would also encourage you not to feed animals out on the deck. Sometimes people feed their dogs or cats outside, and then the raccoons and skunks take advantage of that. They start paying too much attention to human food instead of natural food. Sometimes feeding wildlife food that's not meant for them isn't good for them. You might not see the immediate effects, but you may see the effects later on. And human food isn't always necessarily good for wild animals. And lastly, I know a lot of people like to feed hummingbirds. I would just encourage you to use just the plain old sugar and water. 4 parts of water, 1 part of sugar. It's much better for them than the dyes mixes that you get in the store. They don't need the dyes in them, and the plain old sugar water is better for them. And then remember that it's not just nectar that they drink, they also eat insects. So if you have a great flower garden, you're providing not just the nectar for them, but the spiders and other insects as well. So with that, I hope that I'll turn off my share screen in a minute, but just think about maybe what you have in your own backyard, what you want to see in your backyard. Take your cup of coffee or tea out in the morning in your lawn chair and just watch and listen and see what kinds of animals might use your property and what you might do to enhance the habitats that are there, and enjoy that. I apologize for this screen. These are some of the resources available. The last minute when I tried to save this program, it wouldn't let me, it did an older version, it wouldn't let me change the color of the websites. So I'll fix that, and in the email that Juno sends around, there'll be the various websites that you can access to get these resources. New Hampshire Fish and Game is a great resource. They have all sorts of ideas for living with wildlife and providing habitat for wildlife. The UNH Cooperative Extension is also really valuable in terms of looking for the kinds of plants that you can put in your yard to benefit wildlife. And then the Natural Resources Conservation Service has cost share programs that can help you manage some of your land as well. So great resources. And then these are 3 books I use and I find quite interesting and helpful for thinking about wildlife habitat around my house. The New England Wildlife book is great because it has in the beginning a good discussion about the history of New England landscapes, and the human and animal uses in the different forests and other ecosystems that we have in New England. So those are available too. And that'll be, since this will be recorded, you can check back and get the names of those books without having to quickly scribble all that. So that's it. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can get everybody up here. See if there's any questions or comments.
There's a few questions in the chat box, and people are welcome to add more. I have lots of questions, and people are welcome to raise their hand or unmute and ask questions that way. Are you seeing the chat box, or would you?
Yep, I'm seeing the.
Starting with, do we have any possums in our area yet?
That's a good question. I don't know in our area. If they're up in our area, I know that down in the southern part of the state, they're breeding. But I don't know about this area. That's a good question. Maybe somebody else has seen some dead on the side of the road and know how far north they've gotten. But the limiting factor for possum moving northward is temperature in the winter. They don't have any hair on their ears and they don't have any hair on their tail. So they often end up in wildlife rehab centers with damaged ears and tails because of frostbite. So that's one of the limiting factors. Although they're really good at scavenging all sorts of fruits and insects and things like that. So. For some reason, I lost the chat box. There we go. I got it. Should nest boxes be cleaned out? I think you could probably find information on that at the Cornell Lab Ornithology. I usually clean mine out. I've read that it's beneficial because there are sometimes the larvae of parasites that remain in the nest box, kind of down in the litter of the last nest, and they can hatch out and make problems for the new batch the following year. So I tend to clean mine out and scrape it out. It also is less likely to attract the mice. Sometimes mice don't have any issue with going in there and building on top of all of that. It's already insulated for them. So I would suggest cleaning them out. And the wood duck boxes, we usually go every year, take out the old eggs, the eggshells, and make sure that the material in the box is fresh and dry as well. Let's see, we have an issue regarding trash and junk cars on neighboring property. Do some animals use these items as cover? And if so, which animals? You know, I don't know. I would assume they would. I would assume squirrels and mice would happily go in there for shelter and bring nesting materials in there. I know mice go into cars that are moving frequently and build nests in the air filters. So I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know if something like a fox or, you know, a possum or something like that would use them, but I'm sure there are plenty of small mammals that would take advantage of it. Cleaning out nest boxes, what time of year? I usually do that in the fall. A lot of, well, not a lot, but bluebirds I know do as they move about in their migratory route, both in the fall and in the spring. We'll check out nest boxes as they go. And sometimes it's nice to have a clean box there for the visitors. So cleaning out nest boxes, I don't actually use water. I just take a gloved hand or a stick or something and scrape out everything that I can. If it's really damp in there, I might leave the door open for a little bit and let it dry out completely. But I don't generally clean it out with any kind of bleach or water or anything like that. So. All right, any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat box.
I'll ask some while people are thinking of more.
Okay.
So responding to a few of the things you said, thinking about brush piles that we might have created, not even thinking of them as habitat, then we wouldn't want to burn those in a season when people were using them. So is it safe to burn then in the winter? You know, are they, is there optimal time?
Yeah, either early in the spring before nesting birds are coming back, or later in the fall. I think, you know, the piles that I've ended up burning, usually it's the voles that come running out, and that's in the fall. I mean, the voles will take advantage of those brush piles in the wintertime. And if you were to pick up that brush pile and move it over, you would find little nests of voles in the tunnels underneath from the winter time.
So in the winter, kind of start the burn slow so they can escape. I mean, that's late fall, winter's your time to disturb the least number of.
Yeah, that's
probably
my inclination. Yep.
Water, you know, there's kind of a marshy area where it seems like there's a spring on our land, and we've wondered if we should try to like dig it out a little bit more, if actually like making there be a little bit more of a pooling area would be nice for birds or mammals coming through. Or
yeah, I mean, I would suggest, like with any kind of backyard projects like that, I would suggest spending time down there and seeing how it's getting used. And you know, you don't really want to dig it out if it's a place where frogs go in to lay eggs or things like that, or if there's a lot of insects. But if it's a place that you can help water collect, a little bit deeper, then yeah. But I would suggest kind of looking around and listening and watching it for a while and seeing what uses it.
Oh yeah, and this is probably a good time of year to hang out in a very wet area.
Yeah.
And I had another question about Russian olive as a particular species that seems to be, it seems to crop up a lot. I don't know if it's troublesome, but it also seems like it's good food. And I don't know if you...
Russian olive, I believe, is an invasive species.
So kind of get rid of it when you can.
Yeah, it's better to get rid of it when there's not very much of it than when it gets to be more. And invasive species do supply some food for birds and insects, but they also outcompete the native ones. So the problem with some invasive species is they can spread readily and then outcompete all the native ones. So you're limiting the diversity of shrubs and other plants by having one species that's more aggressive. So it's almost better to get rid of them and try to get the native species in there that can live with each other.
Yeah, and I'll just put in a plug to everybody too for the New Hampshire State Nursery. If you order kind of around Christmas time, they sell lots of like bird wildlife mixes, small plants, quite inexpensive. But if you have a bunch of land to just try things on, you can get conifers, trees, all different kinds of fruiting shrubs from them. Does anything eat choke cherries? I have tons. I bet somebody eats choke cherries.
Oh yeah, birds. Yeah. Birds will eat choke cherries, mice, squirrels. Yeah. They don't taste too good to us, but.
Other questions? Do you have other questions? Ideas to share?
I have a couple, just a couple other sort of backyard thoughts. This time of year, especially coming up, now that bird nesting season is here, there are things that are really good to do in terms of weeding and trimming and things like that, but not necessarily this time of year. So if you feel like you have some trees or shrubs in your yard and they're just getting too thick and you want to thin them out, maybe wait until the end of the summer when birds are done nesting. If you've got a dead tree on your property and you're worried about it landing on your house, wait a little bit longer until the nesting season is over. And kind of pay attention to things like that is really helpful, and prevents or reduces the number of animals that go to wildlife rehab centers. And then this time of year with young animals being around, it's always good to know who your nearest wildlife rehabilitator is, so that if you do discover an issue or have to cut down a tree and then you find out there's a flying squirrel family in there or it's a wood duck home, you know who to call to get some help. So that's one thought. And I guess I would just leave you with encouraging you to be outside. I know the bugs are really bad right now, but those bugs are food for somebody. And spend some time in your yard, in your neighborhood, on the trails around your community, looking and listening and observing and seeing who's in your neighborhood. And then think about what you might do to your own yard or your own property that might be beneficial to wildlife and provide habitat. I didn't really go into anything to do with forest management related to wildlife. There are a lot of foresters that are working on forest management for bird habitat, early successional growth that benefit certain species that are rare or are in trouble in the state. But there are all sorts of resources out there to find help with that. So if you have a larger property and you're going to do a forest management cut, having your forester help you figure out how to manage your forest for wildlife is a great thing to do. So I think I'll just leave you with that.
So Lynn, may I ask a very simple question?
Yes.
I think, how much land do you need to have to make forest management, you know, worth your time or worth your thinking?
Well, I think the current use sort of expectation is 10 acres. I think it depends on what your goals are. If you're looking at trying to just improve wildlife habitat versus whether you're trying to make money off the timber, you're going to have a different approach, and your forestry can help you with that. The New Hampshire Fish and Game has a small grants program for landowners where you can get cost share funding to help you manage property. And that includes managing trees like oaks and beech, mast producing species, and fields and meadows, and things like that. And they require, I think it's a 10-acre minimum parcel to work with.
Thank you.
Let's see, somebody asked about the berry bush with the red berries I showed. I can't remember which one that is, but there was some winterberry in there. Ilex is the genus name, and there's highbush cranberry is another red berried fruit that it's actually wonderful. Cedar waxwings love highbush cranberry, and they'll come in and eat those whatever time of year it is, and they hang on to the fruits a long time into the winter time. All right. Any last minute questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Keep your eyes on the ticks and the black flies, but get outside and have fun.